Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched the stars change color as his ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The year was 2387, and humanity had finally reached beyond their small corner of space to explore the galaxy. Jake had been chosen to lead this mission because he was calm under pressure and good at making quick decisions when things went wrong. The ship's sensors immediately picked up something that made Jake's heart race. Massive alien vessels hung in space ahead of them, each one 10 times larger than any human ship ever built. Their dark metal hulls gleamed with strange energy patterns and weapon systems that looked far more advanced than anything Earth had ever created. "Send them our peaceful greeting message," Jake told his communications officer. They had practiced this moment for years, hoping to make a good first impression on whatever alien life they might find. The message went out in multiple languages and mathematical sequences, showing that humans came in peace and wanted to learn about other civilizations. Response came faster than expected. A cold voice spoke in perfect English through their speakers, somehow having learned their language instantly. "Primitive humans, you have entered space claimed by the Vorthok Empire. Your species is weak and your technology is laughable. We'll surrender your ships and submit to our rule immediately." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. These aliens called themselves the Vorthok, and they clearly had no interest in peaceful contact. Before he could respond, energy beams lanced out from the alien ships and struck the Defiance's shields. The impact threw everyone on the bridge to the floor, and alarms began screaming throughout the ship. "Return fire," Jake shouted as he pulled himself back to his feet. The Defiance's weapon struck the nearest Vorthok ship but seemed to do no damage at all. Their energy shields absorbed every shot effortlessly while their return fire continued to pound the human vessel back on Earth. Admiral Lisa Carter was having the worst day of her career. She stood in the command center on Lunar Station and watched in horror as reports flooded in from across human space. The Vorthok had not just encountered one human ship, they had launched a massive surprise attack on every human world at the same time. The aliens had somehow studied humanity for weeks or months without being detected. They knew the location of every colony, every military base, and every major city on Earth. Their attack was perfectly coordinated and overwhelming in its scope and violence. "Ma'am, we're losing contact with the outer colonies," reported Lieutenant Ben Rodriguez, his voice shaking with fear. "Haven Prime just went dark, and we're getting distress calls from New Terra before their signal cut out." Lisa watched the tactical display as red markers appeared across human space, each one representing a colony under attack or already destroyed. The human fleet was scattered across dozens of worlds, unable to concentrate their forces against this surprise assault. Even worse, the Vorthok ships were clearly superior to anything humans had built. The US Guardian, humanity's most powerful warship, engaged a Vorthok battle group near Mars. Lisa watched in despair as the Guardian's weapons failed to penetrate alien shields while Vorthok plasma cannons tore through human armor like paper. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash, taking 800 crew members with it on Haven Prime. Ben Rodriguez had managed to escape the initial orbital bombardment and was hiding in the ruins of what used to be the colony's main settlement. He watched through his binoculars as Vorthok ground forces landed and began systematically destroying everything humans had built over the past 50 years. The aliens were tall and covered in dark armor that made them look like walking nightmares. They moved with military precision, setting up energy barriers around key locations and using advanced scanners to hunt down any surviving humans. When they found colonists trying to hide, they either killed them immediately or loaded them onto transport ships as prisoners. Ben saw his neighbor Carol Williams dragged from her hiding place by 2 Vorthok soldiers. She fought and screamed, but the aliens were much stronger than any human. They threw her into a transport with dozens of other prisoners, all destined for slavery in alien mining operations across the galaxy. The worst part was how easy it all seemed for the Vorthok. They destroyed human settlements without any apparent effort, their technology so advanced that human resistance was meaningless. It was like watching adults fight children, except the children were being murdered or enslaved. On Earth, President Helen Brooks faced the hardest decision any human leader had ever confronted. Military advisors told her that Earth's defenses would fall within hours. The Vorthok fleet approaching Earth was larger than humanity's entire space navy, and their weapons could crack planets if they chose to use them. "Madam President, we have to evacuate," said General Morrison, Jake's father and the head of Earth's military forces. "If we stay and fight, they'll kill everyone." If we run, at least some of us might survive to fight another day. Helen looked out the window of her office and saw the lights of Washington, D.C., a city that might not exist tomorrow. Somewhere up there, Vorthok ships were preparing to rain death from the sky. She thought about the billions of people depending on her to make the right choice. Begin immediate evacuation of all essential personnel and civilians, she ordered. Send the emergency signal to all colonies. Anyone who can run should run now, before it's too late, as Vorthok ships appeared in Earth's sky and began bombarding major cities. Helen Brooks made one final broadcast to humanity. My fellow humans, we face an enemy stronger than we ever imagined. They have beaten our fleets and destroyed our worlds. But though they may break our bodies and burn our cities, they will never break the human spirit. We will survive this darkness, and we will return. The message went out across space as Earth's great cities burned and millions died in the first day of humanity's darkest hour. 5 years had passed since the Vorthok destroyed human civilization, and Jake Morrison barely recognized himself in the mirror. The clean-shaven naval captain was gone, replaced by a bearded man with scars across his face and eyes that had seen too much death. He commanded what remained of humanity from inside a hollowed-out asteroid they called New Hope. Hidden in a debris field where Vorthok sensors could not find them, the asteroid base was cramped and cold, carved from rock by mining, equipment salvaged from destroyed colonies. Hundreds of humans lived in the tunnels and chambers, survivors who had escaped the initial attack and somehow made their way to this secret refuge. They had turned a dead rock into a home, complete with hydroponic gardens, workshops, and a small medical bay. Jake, you need to see this, called Dr. Amy Patterson from her laboratory deep in the asteroid. She had been Earth's leading expert on alien biology before the war, and now she spent her days studying captured Vorthok technology and trying to understand their weaknesses. Jake made his way through the narrow corridors to Amy's lab, passing families huddled around heating units and engineers working on salvaged equipment. Everyone looked tired and hungry, but they were alive, and that was more than most humans could say. These days Amy stood over a dissection table where pieces of Vorthok armor and weapons lay in neat rows. She had somehow managed to acquire samples during recent raids on alien supply convoys, risking her life to gather intelligence that might help humanity fight back. Look at this, she said, pointing to a complex circuit board pulled from a Vorthok plasma rifle. Their technology is incredibly advanced, but it follows very rigid patterns. Everything is networked together and controlled by central computers. They've conquered dozens of species using the same tactics every time. Jake studied the alien components, trying to understand what Amy had discovered. The Vorthok were clearly superior to humans in every way that mattered for warfare, but Amy seemed to think there might be weaknesses in their approach. Every species they've faced before followed logical military doctrine, Amy continued. When faced with superior force, they surrendered or retreated according to predictable patterns. But humans don't follow those rules. We keep fighting even when it makes no sense to fight. On the occupied world of Kepler Station, engineer Tony Blake was proving Amy's theory correct. He led a small team of saboteurs who had been disrupting Vorthok operations for months. Using tactics that confused and frustrated their alien occupiers, Tony had been a maintenance engineer before the war, someone who fixed broken equipment and kept things running smoothly. Now he used those same skills to break Vorthok equipment in ways that were hard to detect or repair. His team would sneak into alien facilities and introduce tiny flaws that caused major system failures. Days or weeks later, the Vorthok could not understand this approach to warfare. When their transport crashed due to sabotaged navigation systems, they assumed it was equipment failure. When their communication networks went down during important operations, they blamed technical problems rather than enemy action. The aliens expect us to fight like soldiers, Tony explained to his team as they prepared for another mission. They're ready for frontal attacks and organized resistance, but they don't know how to deal with a guy who just wants to make their day worse by breaking their stuff. Tony's approach was working because humans were naturally good at improvisation and chaos. Where other species followed military handbooks and standard procedures, humans would try anything that might work. This unpredictability made them much harder to defeat than the Vorthok had expected back at New Hope. Jake was dealing with internal problems as well as external threats. Not all humans agreed that continued resistance was worth the cost in lives and suffering. Paul Green, a former corporate executive who had escaped Earth during the evacuation, led a faction that wanted to negotiate surrender terms with the Vorthok. We can't win this war, Paul argued during a heated meeting in the asteroid's main assembly chamber. Every day we fight, more humans die. The smart thing to do is surrender now and try to negotiate better treatment for the survivors. Paul's arguments made sense from a logical standpoint. Humanity was outnumbered, outgunned, and had no realistic chance of defeating the Vorthok Empire in conventional warfare. Every military calculation suggested that continued resistance would only lead to complete human extinction, but Jake and most other survivors refused to accept logical defeat, had heard reports from the occupied territories about what happened to humans who surrendered. The Vorthok worked their prisoners to death in mining operations on hostile worlds, treating them like disposable tools rather than living beings. "I've seen what surrender looks like," said Ben Rodriguez, who had escaped from Haven Prime after witnessing the destruction of his colony. "They don't want to rule us or make us citizens of their empire. They want to use us up and throw us away when we're no longer useful." The debate continued for hours, but ultimately the vote was clear. Most humans preferred to die fighting rather than live as slaves, even if that choice seemed irrational to outside observers. This decision would define humanity's approach to the war for years to come. Jake's team proved their determination during a raid on a Vorthok supply convoy passing through the Centauri system. The convoy was heavily defended and the human attack force was outnumbered 5-1, but they struck anyway using improvised weapons and desperate tactics. The battle was brutal and costly. Half the human ships were destroyed and many good people died, but they managed to destroy 3 Vorthok transports loaded with weapons and supplies. More importantly, they proved that humans could still hurt their enemies despite overwhelming odds. The raid sent shockwaves through Vorthok command structure. Supreme Commander Zethkar had expected human resistance to collapse within months of the initial attack, but instead it seemed to be growing stronger and more organized. Reports from across occupied space described increasing sabotage and guerrilla attacks. These humans refused to accept reality, Zethkar told his senior officers during a strategy meeting. They continue fighting when any rational species would have surrendered years ago. Perhaps we need to take more direct action to eliminate this persistent annoyance, but taking direct action against human resistance was proving more difficult than expected. The survivors had learned to hide in places where Vorthok technology could not easily find them, and their hit-and-run tactics made them hard to target with conventional military force. Amy Patterson's research was beginning to bear fruit as well. She had discovered that Vorthok neural implants, which controlled their rigid military hierarchy, could be disrupted by certain electromagnetic frequencies. This knowledge would eventually lead to weapons that could turn the aliens' greatest strength into a weakness as the 5th year of occupation drew to a close. Jake Morrison looked around the assembly chamber of New Hope and saw something the Vorthok had failed to account for. Despite years of suffering and loss, despite being hunted across the galaxy like animals, the humans gathered around him still had hope in their eyes. They still believed they could win, even when logic said otherwise. That belief, that stubborn refusal to accept defeat, was something the Vorthok Empire had never encountered before in their centuries of conquest. It was the one human trait that their advanced technology and superior firepower could not overcome, and it would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of New Hope and studied the holographic display showing human resistance cells across the galaxy. What had started as scattered groups of survivors had grown into an organized network of fighters, spies, and support personnel. He now held the rank of general, though his army consisted of refugees and volunteers rather than professional soldiers. Intelligence Officer Kate Walsh entered the command center carrying a datapad filled with the latest reports from across human space. She had been a computer programmer before the war, but 5 years of resistance work had turned her into one of humanity's most effective spies and coordinators. "The network is fully operational," Kate reported with satisfaction. "We have active cells on 37 worlds and communication links with resistance groups on dozens more. The Vorthok still don't understand how we're coordinating operations across such vast distances." The secret to human coordination was something the aliens had not anticipated. While Vorthok communications relied on sophisticated technology that could be detected and disrupted, humans used simple methods that were almost impossible to trace. Dead drops, coded messages hidden in civilian broadcasts, and personal contacts, built over years of careful work. Amy Patterson had made another breakthrough in her ongoing study of Vorthok technology. She called Jake and Kate to her laboratory to demonstrate her latest discovery, a device that could disrupt the networked systems the aliens used to coordinate their military operations. "Watch this," Amy said, as she activated a small electronic device pointed at a captured Vorthok communication unit. The alien technology immediately began malfunctioning. its displays flickering and its processors overheating from confused signals. Vorthok systems are designed for perfect coordination and efficiency, Amy explained. But that makes them vulnerable to chaos and unpredictability. If we can introduce random elements into their networks, we can cause massive system failures across entire fleets. Amy's electromagnetic pulse weapons were based on human understanding of improvisation and disorder, where Vorthok engineers designed systems to work perfectly under ideal conditions. Human engineers had learned to build things that worked adequately under terrible conditions. This difference in approach was becoming a significant advance. The colony world of New Terra, Governor Rick Hayes was organizing the largest remaining human population into a support network for the resistance. Nearly 1 million humans lived in the underground cities they had carved beneath the planet's surface, hidden from Vorthok orbital sensors by layers of rock and metal. Rick's wife Linda Hayes ran the medical facilities that treated wounded resistance fighters and civilians injured in Vorthok raids. She had been a nurse before the war, but years of emergency medicine had made her skilled at treating injuries that would have been impossible to survive in peacetime. We're not just hiding down here, Rick told a gathering of civilian leaders. Every person who grows food, manufactures equipment, or provides medical care is part of the fight against the Vorthok. They want to break our spirit by making us feel helpless, but we're proving that humans can survive and organize even under the worst conditions. The civilian support network was crucial to resistance operations. While fighters like Jake Morrison attracted Vorthok attention, ordinary people like Rick and Linda Hayes provided the foundation that made continued resistance possible. They demonstrated that human strength came not from individual heroes but from entire communities working together. The Vorthok had noticed the increasing effectiveness of human resistance and decided to respond with overwhelming force. Supreme Commander Zethkar deployed his elite Crusher battalions to eliminate the largest known human populations. Beginning with a massive assault on New Terra, the Crusher battalions were the Vorthok Empire's most feared military units, equipped with planet-killing weapons and trained to destroy entire civilizations. They had been used to eliminate dozens of resistant species over the centuries, and Zethkar was confident they would finally end the human problem. But the Crushers had never faced an enemy that refused to fight according to established military doctrine. When they landed on New Terra, expecting to find organized defensive positions, they instead encountered a population that had simply disappeared underground, leaving behind empty cities and abandoned settlements. The humans had not retreated or surrendered as expected. Instead, they had adapted their entire society to become invisible to conventional military force. The Vorthok found themselves trying to fight an enemy they could not locate, target, or engage in meaningful combat. Blake's sabotage teams struck the Crusher battalions using tactics that violated every principle of military logic. Instead of attempting to destroy Vorthok forces directly, they focused on making the aliens' mission as difficult and frustrating as possible. Don't try to kill them, Tony instructed his teams. Try to drive them crazy. Break their equipment in ways they can't understand. Make their maps wrong. Contaminate their food supplies with harmless but disgusting additives. Force them to waste time and resources on problems that shouldn't exist. The psychological impact of these tactics was greater than the physical damage they caused. Crusher battalion commanders found themselves dealing with equipment failures, supply problems, and communication breakdowns that made no tactical sense. Their efficient military machine was being degraded by what seemed like random chaos. The major test of human determination came at the Titan mining complex, a massive industrial facility that the Vorthok used to process raw materials for their war machine. Jake Morrison coordinated a combined operation involving multiple resistance cells, civilian support networks, and Tony Blake's sabotage teams. The plan was incredibly complex and required precise timing across multiple star systems. Human agents would disable Vorthok security systems while sabotage teams planted explosives throughout the facility. Meanwhile, Jake's fighters would engage the orbital defense platforms to prevent reinforcements from arriving. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong during the operation. Communication failures isolated different teams, security systems that should have been disabled remained active, and Vorthok reinforcements arrived ahead of schedule. By any reasonable measure, the mission should have been aborted as soon as problems began, but humans had learned not to rely on reasonable measures or ideal conditions. When the original plan failed, individual teams improvised new approaches on the spot. When communication systems went down, local commanders made decisions based on incomplete information and hoped for the best. Tony Blake found himself trapped in a Vorthok control room with his explosives failing to detonate properly. Instead of retreating, he began manually destroying equipment with whatever tools he could find, turning a sophisticated sabotage mission into simple vandalism that proved equally effective. The battle lasted 18 hours and cost hundreds of human lives, but in the end the Titan mining complex was destroyed and its Vorthok defenders were forced to retreat. More importantly, the victory proved that humans could coordinate large-scale operations despite their technological disadvantages. Freem Commander Zethkar reviewed the reports from Titan with growing frustration and confusion. His military advisors could not explain how a species with inferior technology and training had managed to defeat elite Vorthok forces in what should have been a straightforward defensive operation. These humans fight without logic or reason, complained General Vector, one of Zethkar's most experienced commanders. They continue attacking when they should retreat, they improvise when they should follow doctrine, and they treat certain defeat as merely another obstacle to overcome. What the Vorthok failed to understand was that human illogic was actually a form of advanced problem-solving adapted to chaotic conditions. Where alien military doctrine assumed predictable conditions and rational opponents, human thinking was designed to work when everything went wrong and rational solutions were impossibles. News of the Titan victory spread throughout human space. Resistance cells on dozens of worlds launched their own attacks on Vorthok installations. The aliens found themselves fighting a war where every victory seemed to inspire new enemies, and every defeat encouraged existing ones to fight harder. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of New Hope and watched the tactical display fill with reports of successful operations across human space. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to believe that humanity might actually have a chance of survival, but survival was no longer enough for the humans scattered across the galaxy. They had learned to fight and win against impossible odds, and they were beginning to dream of something larger than mere existence in the shadows of their former civilization. 2 more years had transformed the scattered human resistance into something resembling a real military force. General Jake Morrison commanded operations from the mobile command ship New Horizon, a converted freighter that had been rebuilt with Dr. Amy Patterson's latest weapons and defensive systems. The ship could outrun most Vorthok vessels and hit harder than anything its size had a right to. Intelligence Officer Kate Walsh had expanded her spy network beyond human space and was now receiving information from sources throughout the Vorthok Empire. Her latest discovery was the most important intelligence breakthrough of the war. Information that would change everything about humanity's approach to the conflict. The Vorthok Empire is fighting wars on 7 different fronts, Kate reported. During a strategy meeting in New Horizons' cramped command center, they're dealing with rebellions, border conflicts, and resource shortages across their territory. Our resistance isn't just annoying them, it's preventing them from deploying forces where they're desperately needed. Jake studied the intelligence reports with growing excitement. For years, humans had felt like they were fighting an impossibly powerful enemy, but the reality was more complex. The Vorthok Empire was vast but spread thin, and their resources were not unlimited. The revelation changed human strategy from simple survival to actively disrupting Vorthok operations. If the aliens needed to keep large numbers of troops in human space to maintain control, those troops could not be used to fight other wars. Human resistance was becoming a strategic liability that the Empire could not afford to ignore. Unoccupied Earth resistance leader Sam Collins was organizing the most ambitious operation in human history. He planned to coordinate simultaneous uprisings in every major city on the planet, timed to coincide with orbital strikes from Jake Morrison's fleet. Sam had been a factory worker before the war, but 7 years of underground resistance had made him a skilled military commander and inspirational leader. He understood that the symbolic importance of liberating Earth would be worth almost any cost in human lives. "We're not trying to hold territory," Sam explained to his cell leaders during a secret meeting in the ruins of New York City. "We're trying to send a message to every human in the galaxy and every species under Vorthok rule. We're showing them that even the Empire's greatest prize can be challenged." The Earth uprising required months of careful preparation and incredible coordination across a planet crawling with Vorthok security forces. Human agents had to move weapons, organize cells, and establish communication networks while avoiding detection by alien surveillance systems. Dr. Amy Patterson's research had produced new technologies that made the uprising possible. Her electromagnetic shielding could hide human equipment from Vorthok sensors, While her improved weapons could penetrate alien personal armor for the first time in the war, the key breakthrough was understanding that Vorthok technology relies on quantum entanglement for real-time communication, Amy explained to Jake as they prepared for the Earth operation. If we can disrupt those quantum links, their forces become isolated and vulnerable to conventional attacks. Amy's anti-quantum weapons were crude compared to Vorthok technology, but they worked by introducing chaos into systems designed for perfect order. Weapons turned the aliens' greatest technological advantage into a weakness that human forces could exploit. The Earth uprising began at exactly midnight Greenwich time, with explosions and attacks erupting simultaneously across the planet. Vorthok commanders found their communication networks failing and their reinforcement requests going unanswered as quantum disruption spread through their systems in London. Resistance fighters, led by former teacher Mary Wilson, stormed war administrative centers and freed thousands of human prisoners. In Tokyo, engineer Ken Nakamura's sabotage teams destroyed alien industrial facilities that had been built on the ruins of human cities. The psychological impact of the uprising was immediate and devastating to Vorthok morale. Earth was supposed to be the crown jewel of their conquest, proof that humanity had been completely defeated. Instead, it became a symbol of continued human defiance and the Empire's inability to maintain control. Morrison's fleet arrived in Earth orbit just as the ground uprising reached its peak. The combined space and surface attacks overwhelmed Vorthok defenders who had grown complacent after years of peaceful occupation. Captain Emma Stone commanded the strike cruiser Retribution, one of the few purpose-built warships in the human fleet. Her ship had been constructed in secret shipyards hidden in asteroid belts, using technology reverse-engineered from captured Vorthok equipment to target their command ship. Emma ordered as her weapons locked onto the Vorthok flagship orbiting above Europe. If we can take out their coordination center, the ground forces will be isolated and vulnerable. The space battle above Earth lasted 6 hours and costs both sides heavily, but human forces achieved their primary objective. The Vorthok were forced to withdraw from Earth's surface and establish a defensive perimeter in the outer solar system, effectively conceding that they could no longer guarantee control of humanity's homeworld. The victory had consequences far beyond Earth itself. News of the uprising spread throughout the galaxy via Vorthok communication networks, reaching species that had been under alien rule for centuries. For the first time, these conquered peoples saw proof that the Empire could be successfully challenged. Patterson's joint research with alien scientists, who had defected from the Vorthok, produced revolutionary advances in faster-than-light travel and communication. These technologies allowed human forces to coordinate operations across vast distances and respond to threats more quickly than ever before. The defecting scientists brought more than just technology. They brought detailed intelligence about Vorthok military doctrine, political structure, and resource limitations. This information revealed that the Empire was far more fragile than it appeared to outside observers. The Vorthok maintained control through fear and the illusion of invincibility, explained Dr. Zephyrin, a former Vorthok research scientist who had joined the human resistance. But their actual military strength is concentrated in a relatively small number of elite units. If those units can be defeated or neutralized, entire sectors of their empire become vulnerable. Reports began arriving of uprisings on other Vorthok worlds as news of Earth's liberation inspired rebellions throughout the Empire. The Zephyrian species, which had been conquered 50 years earlier, launched coordinated attacks on alien installations across their former territory. Captain Emma Stone made contact with Zephyrian rebel forces and began coordinating joint operations between human and alien resistance groups. This cooperation marked the beginning of what would become the Coalition of Free Worlds, a multi-species alliance dedicated to overthrowing Vorthok rule. Supreme Commander Zethkar found himself facing the worst crisis in the Empire's history. Military units were being withdrawn from frontier wars to deal with internal rebellions, leaving Vorthok borders vulnerable to external enemies. The economic cost of maintaining occupation forces was bankrupting entire sectors. The human infection is spreading, Zethkar told his senior advisors during an emergency council session. Their irrational refusal to accept defeat is inspiring other species to attempt similar resistance. We must eliminate the human threat before it destroys everything we have built. But eliminating the human threat was proving impossible using conventional military force. Every victory against human forces seemed to inspire new resistance, while every defeat encouraged existing rebels to fight harder. The Vorthok were discovering that their traditional approach to conquest was ineffective against enemies who refused to follow rational military doctrine. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of New Horizon and watched Earth growing larger on the main screen as his fleet approached humanity's liberated homeworld. The planet still bore scars from years of occupation and the recent uprising, but human cities were already being rebuilt and human flags flew over major population centers. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the initial attack, Jake believed that humanity had a realistic chance of not just surviving but actually winning. The empire that had seemed invincible 7 years ago was showing cracks, and those cracks were growing larger with each human victory. More importantly, humanity was no longer fighting alone. The coalition of free worlds was growing stronger every day, uniting species that had never worked together before under the simple principle that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The human spirit that refused to be broken was becoming a galactic force for liberation. The coalition of free worlds had grown from a desperate alliance between humans and Zephyrians into a galactic rebellion involving dozens of species. General Jake Morrison found himself commanding not just human resistance fighters, but a diverse fleet of alien vessels united by their shared hatred of Vorthok oppression. Ambassador Nina Ross, who had served in Earth's diplomatic corps before the war, worked tirelessly to organize the political structure of the coalition. Her offices on the liberated world of New Terra had become the unofficial capital of the rebellion, where representatives from conquered species gathered to coordinate their fight for freedom. "We're not just fighting a war anymore," Nina explained during a coalition council meeting. "We're building the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization, one based on cooperation rather than conquest. Every species we liberate becomes stronger evidence that the Vorthok way is not the only way." The coalition's strength came from combining the unique abilities of different species rather than trying to impose uniform military doctrine. Human unpredictability worked alongside Zephyrian technological innovation and Korlon strategic thinking to create military capabilities that no single species could achieve alone. Dr. Amy Patterson's joint research facilities had become the scientific heart of the rebellion. Working with alien scientists from a dozen different species, she was developing technologies that surpassed anything that Vorthok had created through conquest and forced labor. The breakthrough came when we stopped trying to copy Vorthok technology and started designing systems that reflected our own strengths, Amy reported to the coalition leadership. Human adaptability, Zephyrian precision, and Korlon creativity produced better results than any Empire approach based on rigid standardization. The new faster-than-light communication networks allowed coalition forces to coordinate operations across the entire galaxy in real time. This technological advantage meant that scattered rebel groups could now function as a unified military force rather than isolated resistance. Cells on the coalition world of Harmony Station, civilian coordinator Mike Johnson worked with alien partners to establish governmental systems that could accommodate the needs of multiple species. His experience as a city planner before the war had prepared him for the challenge of building inclusive societies from scratch. "The key is remembering that different species have different needs," Mike explained to his mixed species staff. "Humans need social interaction and personal freedom. Zephyrians require precise schedules and clear hierarchies, while Korlons thrive on creative challenges and individual expression. Our government has to work for everyone." The success of multi-species cooperation on coalition worlds proved that the Vorthok Empire's claim about the impossibility of galactic peace was simply wrong. Species that had been enemies for centuries were learning to work together when given alternatives to conquest and domination. Intelligence reports suggested that the Vorthok Empire was facing internal dissent for the first time in its history. Military commanders who had never questioned Supreme Commander Zethkar's orders were beginning to wonder if the endless wars against rebelling species were worth the cost. Some of their generals are privately questioning whether the human war was a mistake, Kate Walsh reported during a coalition intelligence briefing. "They're arguing that the resources spent fighting us could have been used to strengthen their borders against external threats." The psychological pressure on Vorthok forces was becoming evident in decreased combat effectiveness and increasing surrender rates. Alien soldiers who had been raised to believe in the Empire's invincibility were losing confidence when faced with enemies who refused to be intimidated. The decisive test of coalition strength came at the Nexus Gate, a massive space station that controlled hyperspace routes to the galactic core. Supreme Commander Zethkar had concentrated the Empire's most powerful fleet there, determined to prevent coalition forces from threatening the Vorthok homeworld's captain. Emma Stone commanded the coalition fleet that approached the Nexus Gate. Knowing that this battle would determine the future of the rebellion, her ships represented every species in the coalition, from human cruisers to Zephyrian dreadnoughts to Corlan stealth vessels. "Remember that we're not just fighting for our own freedom," Emma told her mixed-species crew before the battle began. "We're fighting for every species that has ever suffered under Vorthok rule, and for every species that might face conquest in the future. Today we prove that cooperation is stronger than oppression." The battle for the Nexus Gate was the largest space engagement in galactic history, involving thousands of ships from dozens of different species. Vorthok forces had overwhelming technological advantages and superior numbers, but coalition forces had something the Empire had never learned to counter: human tactical innovations combined with alien technologies in ways that confused and frustrated Vorthok commanders. When conventional attacks failed, coalition forces improvised new approaches that violated every principle of established military doctrine. The turning point came when Dr. Patterson's neural disruption technology was deployed against Vorthok command ships. The weapons did not destroy alien vessels, but instead disabled the implants that enforced rigid military hierarchy throughout their forces for the first time in the Empire's history. Individual Vorthok soldiers began making their own decisions rather than following orders from Central Command. Some continued fighting, others attempted to retreat, and a few even switched sides to join coalition forces. The chaos spread throughout the Vorthok fleet as officers found themselves unable to coordinate their forces effectively. Ships that had fought in perfect formation for decades suddenly became isolated units fighting independent battles against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Captain Emma Stone's flagship Retribution led a desperate assault against the Nexus Gate's Central Command complex, fighting through layers of defensive systems while coalition forces battled throughout the station's corridors and docking bays. The station's fall sent shockwaves throughout the Vorthok Empire as news spread that their most important strategic position had been captured by rebel forces. More importantly, the victory proved that coalition cooperation could overcome even the Empire's greatest military advantages. Supreme Commander Sethkar faced a choice that no Vorthok leader had ever confronted before. His empire was collapsing from within as species after species joined the rebellion, while external enemies pressed against weakened borders. Continuing the war against the coalition would likely result in the complete destruction of everything his people had built. "The humans have done something unprecedented," Sethkar admitted to his remaining loyal advisors. "They have united our enemies against us and inspired them with their own irrational determination. Perhaps it is time to consider that there might be alternatives to eternal conquest." The idea of negotiating with rebels was heretical according to Vorthok tradition, but the alternative was watching their civilization destroy itself in unwinnable wars. For the first time in centuries, the Empire was being forced to consider diplomacy rather than domination. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the captured Nexus Gate and watched coalition ships arriving from across the galaxy. Representatives of dozens of species were coming to discuss the terms of a permanent peace treaty that would reshape galactic civilization. The war that had begun with humanity's desperate struggle for survival had become something larger than anyone had imagined. The human spirit that refused to be broken had inspired a galactic transformation, proving that cooperation and determination could overcome any form of oppression. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Building a lasting peace would require the same determination and innovation that had won the war, and there were no guarantees that former enemies could learn to work together as equal partners rather than conquerors and conquered. Supreme Commander Sethkar arrived at the Nexus Gate aboard his personal flagship, escorted by the last loyal ships of the Vorthok fleet. The mighty empire that had once controlled half the galaxy was now reduced to a few dozen star systems. While rebellions raged across former Vorthok territory, General Jake Morrison waited in the station's main docking bay to meet his former enemy face to face for the first time. 10 years of war had aged both leaders, but their meeting represented something unprecedented in galactic history. A conqueror coming to negotiate rather than demand surrender. "You have accomplished something that should have been impossible," Sethkar said as he stepped off his transport, flanked by nervous Vorthok guards. "My people have ruled this galaxy for 1,000 years, and no species has ever successfully resisted our expansion. Yet here you stand, having not only survived, but inspired others to join your cause." Jake studied the alien commander who had caused so much human suffering and death. Sethkar was shorter than he had expected, his armor showing wear from years of constant warfare. The Supreme Commander looked tired rather than defeated, like someone who had finally realized that his approach to the universe was fundamentally flawed. Dr. Amy Patterson's neural disruption technology had been refined to target specific Vorthar command implants without causing permanent damage. The weapons could now selectively disable the forced loyalty systems that had maintained Empire discipline for centuries, giving individual Vorthok soldiers the freedom to make their own choices. The demonstration of this technology during peace negotiations was crucial to convincing Zethkar that continued warfare was futile. When his own guards began questioning orders and expressing personal opinions for the first time in their lives, he understood that the Empire's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. "Your weapons do not just defeat our forces," Zethkar observed as he watched his soldiers discussing strategy rather than simply following commands. "They transform our people into something we have never been before. They make us individuals rather than components of a military machine." Ambassador Nina Ross led the coalition negotiating team, working to establish terms that would end the war without simply reversing the cycle of conquest and oppression. Her goal was to create a framework for permanent peace based on cooperation rather than domination. "We're not seeking to destroy the Vorthok Empire," Nina explained during the formal negotiations. "We want to transform it into something that can coexist with free species rather than constantly seeking to conquer them. Your people have skills and knowledge that could benefit everyone if channeled toward cooperation rather than warfare." The negotiations were complicated by the fact that neither side fully trusted the other. Coalition species had suffered under Vorthok rule for generations, while Vorthok leaders feared that peace would leave them vulnerable to revenge attacks from former victims. Captain Emma Stone commanded the coalition fleet that maintained security around the Nexus Gate during negotiations. Her ships represented the military strength that made peace possible, but their diverse composition also demonstrated the cooperative principles that would govern the post-war galaxy. "Every ship in this fleet represents species that were once enemies," Emma reminded her crew during a briefing. "Humans fought the Zephyrians over territory rights 50 years ago, and the Corlans raided both our worlds for resources. But we learned to work together when faced with a common threat. Now we have to prove that cooperation can survive in peacetime." The breakthrough in negotiations came when Dr. Patterson proposed sharing her neural disruption technology with the Vorthok, rather than using it as a weapon against them. This gesture of trust convinced many Vorthok leaders that the coalition was genuinely interested in peace rather than revenge. "If we give them the ability to free their own people from forced loyalty implants, they can rebuild their society based on voluntary cooperation," Amy explained to skeptical coalition representatives. "It's a risk, but it's also the only way to ensure that this peace agreement will last longer than the next generation." The decision to share the technology was controversial within the coalition, but it ultimately proved that human principles about freedom and self-determination applied to former enemies as well as allies. This demonstration of consistency convinced wavering Vorthok factions to support the peace process. The final crisis came when hardline Vorthok military units launched a desperate assault on the Nexus Gate, determined to prevent their empire from accepting what they saw as humiliating surrender. Supreme Commander Zethkar found himself in the unprecedented position of fighting against his own forces to protect peace negotiations. Jake Morrison's human fighters fought alongside Vorthok loyalists against the rebel Vorthok fleet, a situation that would have been unimaginable at the beginning of the war. The alliance held together despite mutual suspicion because both sides recognized that failure would mean a return to endless warfare. The battle was brief but intense, with ships that had been designed to fight each other now coordinating their attacks against common enemies. When the hardline Vorthok forces were defeated, their surrender marked the end of the old empire and the beginning of something entirely new. "This is not defeat," Zethkar announced to his remaining forces after the battle. "This is transformation. We have learned that conquest creates only temporary strength, while cooperation builds lasting prosperity. Our future lies not in dominating other species, but in working with them as equals." The peace treaty that emerged from months of negotiation established the Galactic Confederation, a voluntary association of species committed to mutual defense and cooperative development. The document began with principles directly inspired by human concepts of individual freedom and collective responsibility. Ambassador Nina Ross delivered the closing speech at the signing ceremony, addressing representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the Nexus Gate's Great Assembly Hall. Her words summarized everything that humanity had learned during 10 years of desperate struggle. "We have proven that the spirit of freedom cannot be broken by any amount of force or oppression," Nina declared to the assembled delegates. "When faced with extinction, we chose to fight rather than surrender. When offered the chance for revenge, we chose cooperation instead. Today we establish not just peace between former enemies, but a new way of organizing galactic civilization. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Many species struggled to adapt to voluntary cooperation after centuries of authoritarian rule, while others found it difficult to trust former oppressors despite official peace agreements. But the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented. In galactic history, Jake Morrison returned to Earth 5 years after the peace treaty was signed, finding a world that had been rebuilt stronger than before the war. Human cities incorporated architectural styles learned from alien partners, while former battlefields had been converted into parks and memorial gardens. The memorial gardens, the memorial to the war's victims, included names from dozens of species, honoring not just human sacrifice but the courage of everyone who had fought for freedom. The inscription was written in over 100 languages, but the central message was simple: the spirit of freedom, once awakened, can never again be silenced. Dr. Amy Patterson's research had shifted from weapons development to peaceful applications of the technologies discovered during the war. Her work on neural enhancement was helping former Vorthok soldiers adapt to life without implanted loyalty controls, while her communication systems were enabling unprecedented cooperation between distant worlds. The war taught us that diversity is strength rather than weakness, Amy reflected during a scientific conference attended by researchers from across the galaxy. Every species brings unique perspectives and capabilities that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Our greatest discoveries come from combining different approaches rather than imposing uniform solutions. The human spirit that had refused to be broken during the darkest years of the war had become the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. Species that had never imagined working together as equals were discovering that cooperation produced better results than conquest or domination. 10 years after the peace treaty, Jake Morrison stood in his garden on Earth and watched ships from dozens of worlds crossing the sky above him. The galaxy was still far from perfect, with conflicts and disagreements that required constant diplomatic attention. But the principle had been established that problems could be solved through negotiation, rather than warfare. The war had ended, not with the total victory of one side over another, but with the transformation of everyone involved. Humans had learned that their greatest strength lay not in superior technology or military might, but in their stubborn refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed pointless. That refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds, had inspired a galactic revolution that changed the fundamental nature of interstellar civilization. The human spirit that could not be broken had proven strong enough to break the chains that had bound countless other species for centuries.